Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us straight out of the Judge Vault. Now, if you're in a hurry, I'll lead off with the correct answer, which is that if Blood Moon entered first, Urza's Saga will be a mountain, and it will only be able to tap for red. If Urza's Saga was already in play when the Blood Moon entered, then that'll turn the Urza Saga into a mountain, and it'll be able to tap for red, but it will retain the ability that lets it tap for colorless, and the one that creates construct tokens if it had that. In either case, Blood Moon will freeze Urza's Saga at its current chapter number, blocking any new lore counters from being put on Urza's Saga. This includes the one that it would normally get each turn after you draw, and the one that it gets as it enters. Any lore counters already on it would stay though, and the Saga progress would resume as normal after Blood Moon leaves the battlefield. Now, if that's all you needed, be sure to leave a like and a comment on your way out so the algorithm doesn't punish me too hard for respecting your time. For everybody who's interested in where that answer came from, let's dig in. First off, Blood Moon will affect Urza's Saga, because Urza's Saga is a land, and it does not have the supertype Basic. Now, this makes Urza's Saga a non-basic land. Now, that being said, let's consider what the rest of Urza's Saga's type line will look like. Blood Moon sets the subtype of all non-basic lands to Mountain. Because Blood Moon does not specify that the lands get to keep their original subtypes, for example with wording like in addition to their other types or something similar, that means Mountain completely overwrites any other land subtypes that Urza's Saga had. Now, there's no general way to know this other than by looking at the relevant sections of the CR, but I can tell you that Urza's is a land subtype and Saga is an enchantment subtype. Now, this is important because Blood Moon only wants to change land subtypes. Card types are unaffected, and the same is true for any subtypes corresponding to any card type besides land. Urza's Saga doesn't have any super types like Snow or Legendary, but if it did, those would likewise be unaffected. This means the final type line for Urza's Saga will look like this. It'll be an Enchantment Land - Mountain Saga. If you're familiar with how Blood Moon interacts with Dryad Arbor, this should look pretty familiar because that ruling uses exactly the same principles. Now let's consider what abilities the Urza's Saga will have. You might have already noticed in the mockup that I had on screen earlier that I switched from the Saga card layout to the normal one, and that's because it doesn't really make sense to use the Saga layout given that Urza's Saga won't have any chapter abilities anymore. If you've played with Blood Moon before, you already know that one of the things it does is it gets rid of all the non-basic land's abilities. This is because of this rule here, which says that setting a land's subtype to Mountain gets rid of all the abilities that the land has and gives the ability to tap for red mana. This includes Urza's Saga's chapter abilities, even though most people would say that these abilities are more strongly associated with being a saga than being a land. The game makes no such distinction. Blood Moon removes all the abilities that are printed on the card, whether they have anything to do with being a land or not. Because it's a game rule removing these abilities and not a continuous effect, it happens at the same time as Blood Moon changes the land's subtypes, which is in Layer 4. And this is going to be important for when we consider what other abilities the Urza Saga might have. And I imagine that last sentence caused a couple of eyebrows to go up. Other abilities? Why would Urza Saga have any other abilities if Blood Moon is taking all its abilities away? Well, if you've been a fan of the channel for a while now, you might remember my video about Blood Moon and Bootlegger's Stash, where the Bootlegger's Stash gave its ability to non-basic lands after Blood Moon took away all their abilities. This is true no matter what order those cards entered the battlefield because of what we were talking about earlier, where Blood Moon's ability removing actually happens in Layer 4, which is before Layer 6, the layer when ability adding and removing usually happens. Now, even if we don't have a Bootlegger Stash in play, there's still a decent chance that there will be a continuous effect acting on Urza's Saga that wants to give it an ability. To see why, let's observe how the Chapter 1 ability of this card is worded. Urza's Saga gains tap, add colorless. This is a continuous effect that wants to give an ability to the Urza's Saga. Now guess what? This works exactly like what we saw with Bootlegger's Stash. Regardless of timestamps, if the Urza's Saga Chapter 1 ability has resolved, that Urza's Saga will gain the ability to tap for 1 colorless mana, and that ability gets added after Blood Moon takes Urza's Saga's abilities away, meaning that even with Blood Moon out, Urza's Saga can still tap for colorless. The same thing is true for the ability that lets you make construct tokens. Urza's Saga will have that if the Chapter 2 ability is resolved, and Blood Moon won't change that fact. Now, I can already hear some people start to wonder about something. If Blood Moon takes away all of Urza's Saga's abilities in Layer 4, how can there be any continuous effects acting on Urza's Saga in Layer 6? Now, this would be a big problem if the Chapter 1 ability was worded something like, as long as one or more lore counters are on this permanent, it has tap, add colorless. In this case, the continuous effect giving Urza's Saga the ability would result from a static ability that the Urza Saga has, which the Blood Moon would indeed take away. But have a look at how the Chapter 1 ability is actually worded. Officially, this ability is a triggered ability that triggers when the first lore counter is put on Urza's Saga, and this triggered ability sets up a continuous effect in the game as it resolves. Blood Moon is not able to change the fact that this triggered ability has resolved, and that's why Urza's Saga can have the activated abilities that it gets at Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, even if Blood Moon is making it lose all its abilities. And so with that, this is what the Urza Saga will look like. It's a colorless Enchantment Land - Mountain Saga with tap add red, tap add colorless, and 2-tap create a construct. Now, if you watched my first video on this topic, you might remember all this is exactly how it worked originally. But you probably also remember me being really sad because none of these cool interactions were relevant unless they were going to print some kind of neutron hate card that cared about whether a land had the Urza's subtype or something. When Urza's Saga was first printed, and for about 4 years after that until the rules changed in the Final Fantasy set, Blood Moon would kill Urza's Saga. Now that happened because if you have a saga that has too many lore counters on it, you have to sacrifice it. Too many being defined by the highest chapter ability that the saga had. So it used to be that if your saga somehow lost all its chapter abilities, any number of lore counters on it would be too many. Now, the rule that makes you sacrifice sagas has been rewritten so that sagas with no chapter abilities are exempt from this state-based action. Therefore, if you have a Blood Moon out removing all the abilities from an Urza Saga, the Urza Saga will remain on the battlefield just like any other non-basic land. Remember, tap add colorless is not a chapter ability. The Urza Saga Chapter 1 ability is, when you put the first lore counter on Urza Saga, it gains tap add colorless. So yeah, officially the Urza Saga would not have any chapter abilities, even though it does have some abilities it gained from its chapter abilities resolving. And with that result set, let's cover a couple of other interactions about how it will behave on the battlefield. First up, you know how you put a lore counter on all of your sagas at the beginning of the main phase? Well, that rule only applies to sagas with chapter abilities. Therefore, if there's a Blood Moon out, it will freeze all of your Urza Sagas at whatever number of lore counters that they had. They won't get any new lore counters unless you proliferate one on there or something like that. Which would actually be a really mean thing to do, because the Urza Saga would not have any chapter abilities that would normally trigger when that happens. And that brings us to the most recent rules change affecting this ruling. If you've played with sagas before, you probably know that normally a saga enters the battlefield with one lore counter already on it. Here's the original text of the game rule that made that happen. And now I'll show you the new rule that currently serves the same purpose. Can you tell the difference? Well, other than breaking out sagas with read ahead into their own separate case, the functional difference is that formerly the rules just put a lore counter on sagas as they entered. Now there's a rule that gives sagas an ability that makes them enter with a lore counter on them. Now, this is a minor and relatively technical difference, but it has an important consequence. Before Secrets of Strixhaven, if you played an Urza Saga while there was a Blood Moon out, the game rules would see a saga entering the battlefield and give it a lore counter. This meant that at the time the first lore counter was put on Urza Saga, it would have no abilities, meaning that it would not gain the ability to tap for colorless. And, having missed this opportunity, there was no normal way for it to ever gain this ability, even if the Blood Moon later left the battlefield. The current rule does not directly give a lore counter to the saga as it enters, though. It gives an ability to the saga, and that ability is responsible for putting the initial lore counter on it. But remember that when Blood Moon sets a non-basic land subtype, that land loses all its abilities, not just the ones printed on it. Okay, actually, if you take a look at the rule that does this, you can see it only references abilities generated from the land's rules text, its old land types, and copy effects acting on the land. The inherent ability that makes the Urza Saga enter with a lore counter on it comes from the Saga subtype, and therefore it doesn't really fall under any of these categories. But Wizards of the Coast has published material indicating that Urza Saga does not enter with an initial lore counter on it under Blood Moon, so it seems reasonable to infer that Blood Moon is intended to take this ability away too. Perhaps in the future we'll see the text of this rule change to make this explicit, since I believe this is the first time it's been possible for a land to have an ability in Layer 4 that did not come from one of those sources. If all that went over your head, the bottom line is that as of the rules change in Secrets of Strixhaven, if you play an Urza Saga while there's a Blood Moon out, the Urza Saga does not enter the battlefield with a lore counter on it. This is a bit of a buff because it means that if the Blood Moon gets removed later, you still get the Chapter 1 ability, but it's also a nerf in that it delays when you get the Chapter 2 and 3 abilities by a turn. I'm a little bit out of the loop as far as competitive metagames are concerned, so I don't feel confident saying whether I think this is an overall plus or minus for Urza's Saga, and I have a feeling it may depend on what format we're talking about, but I'm sure the good people of the comments section will be happy to share their thoughts on this matter. Okay, let's close out with one last fun challenge question to test your understanding. Let's say you have an Urza Saga and you move it to Chapter 3 during your main phase. In response, someone flashes in a Blood Moon effect. What happens? And yes, setting this up in the first place will require a little bit of hoop jumping because Blood Moon doesn't have flash, but you could definitely play it like it has flash via a Vidalcan Orrery, or maybe violin a Harbinger of the Seas, or whatever you want. So anyway, to properly answer this question, we'll need a little bit more formality about when specifically the Blood Moon is entering. Recall that the first thing that happens in the main phase is the turn-based action of putting a lore counter on all your sagas. Doing that will cause the Chapter 3 ability of Urza's Saga to trigger. The earliest chance that you would have to cast a spell in this sequence would be to respond to that triggered ability after it's put on the stack. If you wanted to cast Blood Moon before then, you'd have to do it during the draw step, which would have the same result as if you just played a normal sorcery speed Blood Moon with the Urza's Saga at 2. So let's go through step by step to see what would happen if you responded to the Chapter 3 trigger. We'll start at the very beginning when you're transitioning into the main phase. The first thing that happens is the turn-based action of putting a lore counter on all your sagas. After this, before any player gets priority, triggered abilities that have triggered are put onto the stack. This would include any chapter abilities as well as any abilities that trigger at the beginning of your main phase, like Blinkmithern. If there are multiple triggered abilities that need to go onto the stack, the normal app-nap ordering is used for all of them. Now, if you need a refresher on how that works, go ahead and check out my video on Flicker plus Thought-Knot Seer. If you watch that video, you might have noticed a little bit of a red flag though. State-based actions, such as the thing that makes you sacrifice sagas, are checked after turn-based actions are completed, but before any triggered abilities go on the stack. However, as you can see, the state-based action that makes you sacrifice sagas is carefully worded such that it does not occur until after the last chapter ability has resolved or otherwise left the stack. So after Blood Moon resolves, Urza's Saga will still be in play. Even though it has no chapter abilities, its Chapter 3 ability has already triggered, and once that happens, it exists independently of its source, meaning the Chapter 3 ability will go on to resolve the same as it normally would. After you finish with that is the time when you would officially have to sacrifice the Urza Saga under normal circumstances, but because the Blood Moon is removing all its chapter abilities, the Urza Saga is still exempt from this. And so the Urza Saga will remain on the battlefield with all its lore counters still on it and looking like this. It won't get any new lore counters as long as Blood Moon is in play. As soon as the Blood Moon leaves play, the game will check to see how many lore counters it has and sacrifice it if appropriate. If at that time the Urza Saga has few enough lore counters that it can remain on the battlefield, it'll go back to getting a new one at the start of your main phase, just like it normally would. Phew, that was a lot of material to cover. Give yourself a big pat on the back if you made it all the way here, and if you have any other questions about this interaction, be sure to put them in the comments, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. I think this one is a really interesting situation because it has a lot of moving parts. Both of the times that it changed were unintentional. In Final Fantasy, WotC wanted to change how sagas worked so that a dress down or humility effect wouldn't immediately murk all the saga creatures from that set. And more recently, sagas getting their first counter as a result of an intrinsic ability happened a few months after I pointed out that it was weird that they worked differently from planeswalkers in battles in a conversation with a member of the Magic Rules team. I suppose there's a small chance that this change wasn't 100% due to me personally, since I know some of my colleagues have also brought this same issue up. But even so, this interaction will always have a special place in my heart because my original video explaining how it worked was one of the first DDRs to go viral, garnering over 50,000 views. Which makes sense because it's a really interesting ruling with a lot of non-obvious aspects that's relevant in multiple formats. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.